When Guy Goma sat down for a job interview at the BBC in 2006, he had no idea that he was about to become a cultural sensation. Instead of a job interview, Guy was about to be interviewed live on TV to discuss a high-profile legal case, and the man who put him in the hot seat was this week's guest, Elliott Gotkine. Elliott was working on the business slot on the BBC's news channel, and in the hurly-burly of the newsroom and the sprawling scale of the BBC, he mistakenly ended up placing regular Guy Goma in the interview hot seat instead of genuine expert Guy Goma. And once the mistake had been made, all hell broke loose, and the interview became an iconic moment in British TV history. Elliott has recently published a book on his and Guy's experience of this iconic moment that reveals what went on behind the scenes and the impact on both of them. So relax and listen to Elliott explain how we all ended up with the wrong guy on the TV. Enjoy. Hi Elliott, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Lovely to have you on board. I always like to start with a fun question. And so my fun question to you is this. Who is the one person, past or present, who you would have loved to have interviewed?
Well, I suppose I have to go for someone who has been alive during my lifetime. I mean, I appreciate, interviewing someone like Einstein. I think he was alive during my lifetime. I'm only 50. So I would go for Arnold Schwarzenegger.
And why is that?
You can't see them behind me because I'm in my little study area here, but I have two original posters from the original Terminator. It's a kind of, not even a picture of him, it's kind of like an animated image of him, half Arnie, half cyborg, and the other one is him in that iconic pose atop a Harley, I think it is, in Terminator 2, which is actually signed by him, Lynn Hamilton and Jim Cameron, and I actually bought that on eBay live auctions in the year 2000, and so they both have pride of place in different rooms. I thought putting them both in the same room might be a bit overkill, but I just remember watching all of his movies in the 80s, hiring them on VHS and then kind of watching all of them except for Raw Deal. I'm not sure why I avoided that one.
So obviously a film fan, but were you a big TV fan when you were growing up? And how did you get started in the TV business?
So I grew up, probably like you did, when there were just 3 channels. And that meant, on visits to my grandparents on a Saturday afternoon, you were lucky if you got a bit of wrestling with Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks, and that was like the best. Or maybe you got to see the video printer kind of, putting out the final score on BBC, because of course, you wouldn't actually be able to watch the game. One which just comes to mind right now because I just took my daughter, who's 13, to see the He-Man and the Masters of the Universe movie, which, as the reviewers had pointed out, was absolutely awful. But the reason why I went along with it and was quite happy to go, not least because it's my daughter, but also because I remember getting up in the summer holidays, when I was a kid, at night, I think it was on at 9:25 till 9:45 in the morning, he'd have the He-Man cartoon. And I used to love kind of getting up there and watching it.
And so how did you take that love of He-Man, and by the power of Grayskull, you made it into TV? How did you achieve that?
In terms of TV, I always enjoyed talking, and I didn't want to kind of do what everybody else was doing when I was at university, and I thought journalism sounds quite interesting. I'd been reading The Economist from cover to cover since the age of 16, and I was really interested in what went on in the world and was really passionate about it. And so when I first decided to go into journalism, I started as a runner at London Tonight and then graduated. I was on £12,000 a year as a runner at London Tonight. And then I took a pay cut to become a trainee journalist at Euromoney Publications on the International Financial Law Review and lawmoney.com. That was 3 months. It was actually pretty good journalism training. And then I moved to a financial news website, ukinvest.com, that went, am I allowed to swear in this podcast, or shall I keep it wholesome?
We're relatively wholesome.
Went belly up, we'll say, as part of the dot-com crash. But that was like a really, exciting time to be alive and to be writing about, the internet and tech stocks and all the mania there when you're actually working for one, and had kind of, I suppose, a bit of a vested interest in that, we had some options in this company and dreamed of being millionaires, but most of us lost everything, or at least everything, all the options, I should say. And then eventually from there I made my way to the BBC. Now I wanted to obviously be on camera. You don't walk into the BBC and do that. So I was initially a producer in the business and economics unit because I'd just fallen into business news and I happened to have a decent interest and understanding of it. And then after a year, I was getting a little bit tired of not getting the opportunities that I wanted, because I wanted to be on air. I wanted to be foreign correspondent. And one day we got a piece on the Argentina's debt crisis. You may recall the biggest sovereign default in history. This was in around about Christmas 2001. And we got the report in from Peter Grester, who later found fame as, unfortunately for him, of course, being one of the Al Jazeera journalists that were locked up in Egypt for the crime of having journalistic equipment and being a journalist. And then I just wrote back and said, hey, I speak Spanish. I've been to Latin America. I love it. If there's ever any chance to come out and work there, let me know. And he told me who to speak to. And then, after a little bit of meetings here and there and everywhere, I managed to get the BBC to give me a year's unpaid leave. And I went to Lima, to deepest, darkest Peru as the BBC's stringer in Lima. And then after that, got the South America correspondent job, and things kind of, I took off from there. When I was in Lima, kind of filing my first reports for the BBC, I had to pinch myself because, my dream was to be a South America correspondent for the BBC. And here I was doing it. And it was really just for me a dream come true. And the most memorable for me was, it was almost, I think it was Christmas Eve 2002. I was in the beautiful Barranco apartments, like a kind of trendy part of Lima, of Mario Vargas Llosa, the late Nobel Prize winning author of my Aunt Julia, of Aunt Julia the scriptwriter, and the Cubs and other stories and things like that. And I actually had to study him for my Spanish A-level. So here I was, 8 years later, sitting in the apartment of someone I'd had to study for my Spanish A-level. Interviewing him for the BBC was just, still to this day, I would flag that as one of my proudest moments.
And you also got to interview Hugo Chavez, I think. How was that?
I did. I mean, look, I appreciate, there's much to be criticised of his politics, and not least the person he handed over to as his designated successor, who, of course, is currently in prison in the United States after being snatched by the US. He was a charming person. I do remember that my main interaction with him, I had two kind of interactions. One was when he came, I think this was, I can't remember which came first, but one was when he came for the presidential election, or I think it was maybe the inauguration of Jose Mujica, who was a former left-wing guerrilla turned president in Uruguay, who was famed for his down-to-earth nature and driving a kind of crappy Volkswagen Beetle, I think it was, and other things. And Chavez came into the Radisson Blu Hotel, and along with other leaders from Latin America, to kind of congratulate the new president of Uruguay. And I had this long, in fact, you can see it here, this Sennheiser mic, this very Sennheiser mic. I think I might have had the Rycott Softy on top, for those unfamiliar with them, the kind of fluffy bit, the windbreaker. And but maybe I didn't. I think it was just like that. So it looked a bit more menacing than a normal microphone. And I was pointing it, kind of, waiting to get a soundbite from Hugo Chavez. And then before he walked in, I almost got bundled to the ground by his bodyguards because they thought I was pointing a gun at him. But another occasion was actually at the Inca Sun Temple of Sacsayhuaman. And it was the first meeting of the kind of, I can't remember the name of the grouping again. It was just all the presidents of Latin America. And so, this was Lula from Brazil, his first term. Vicente Fox from Mexico was there. Alvaro Uribe from Colombia. And Hugo Chavez were among the kind of, best known presidents. This was when Alejandro Toledo, who's now also languishing in a US jail, was president of Peru at the time. Amazing how many former Latin American presidents end up there. Anyway, so all the A-listers, let's call them, had gone back to Cusco, and the only one left was Hugo Chavez, and he was kind of standing at a table, and it was like surrounded by journalists, everyone, local, foreign news, everything. And I kind of like, again with the same microphone, but this time with the windbreaker on top, kind of like eased it in between some journalists and kind of held it out, waiting for him to finish talking to one journalist so I could then ask him some questions. And so he was like speaking to one person. I'm like, Senor Chavez, Senor Chavez. It's like nothing. It's like Senor Chavez, BBC de Londres, because they always call it the BBC of London. Anyway, so then he finished speaking to another one, and then I tried one more time, Senor Chavez, BBC de Londres. And he turns and looks at me and he's like, what's that? And he's pointing to the Senate. Amazing. I didn't realise it was going to figure so prominently in this conversation. So it's this is all in Spanish, obviously. I said, it's my microphone. He's like, yeah, but why is it so big? I said, well, it's quite powerful. And then he's like, yeah, but this, journalist, and he referred to another female journalist who was there. She's just got this, little MP3 recorder. Why do you need something so big? I said, I looked at him and I smiled and I said in Spanish, de vez en cuando, señor presidente, el tamaño importa. Like, sometimes size matters, Mr. President. And he kind of looked at me, smiled, and then like gave me a 10-minute interview. And I kind of factored in that little anecdote into a piece from our own correspondent on the BBC. So those are my personal impressions of him.
Muy bien. So back at the BBC in London, and a regular news day played out in an unexpected way. Please share what happened.
Well, I'm guessing you're referring to what happened on May the 8th, 2006. So let's go with that story. So there I am, output editing the business news slot on what was then called BBC News 24, the 24-hour news channel, now just called the news channel. And it's 10 minutes. It's now 10:30 in the morning, 10 minutes before our slot, and there's no sign of our guest. Our guest is a guy called Guy Goma, who I didn't know at the time was one of the UK's foremost technology journalists. He was due to talk about the Apple Computer court case. Apple Computer was being sued by Apple Corps, that's CORPS, the Beatles record label, because Apple Computer had an agreement in place that it wouldn't enter the music business. So this was now with iTunes. Beatles record label had accused it of breaching that understanding, that agreement. So 10:30 in the morning, 10 minutes to go to our slot, no sign of Guy Goma. So don't remember, at the old BBC Television Centre in West London, which is now a Soho House, there were two reception areas. Main reception, stage door. Okay, so I call down to main reception. Have you got a Guy Goma there as a guest? Yes, the receptionist tells me. I'll be down in a minute. I run down the corridor, down the stairs, burst through the barriers like a Terminator, scanning its target, and I don't see any sign of the pale-faced, red-bearded, geeky-looking chap that I'd looked up online a few moments earlier because I didn't know who Guy Goma was, so I'd looked him up. So I turn to the receptionist and I say, which one's Guy Goma? And she points. And I look to where she's pointing, and I see she's pointing to the man we now know and love as Guy Goma. She's pointing to him. I didn't obviously know who he was then. And to say the least, he does not resemble Guy Goma. He's, from the Republic of Congo. And so I turn to the reception. I said, are you sure that's Guy Goma? Yes, she tells me. I go over to him. Guy Goma? Yes, he says. We're now on air in 5 minutes. I've got time to hang around and chat. I've got time to check his ID. I had no reason to assume that this wasn't Guy Goma. I just assumed in that moment that this decision, this split-second decision that I suppose changed the course of his life and mine, that I had looked up the wrong person online. Okay? We didn't have smartphones at the time. I couldn't kind of double-check things. Come with me, I said to him. We ran through the barriers, back up the stairs, through the corridor, into the newsroom. I handed him over to the floor manager. I went to the news gallery, and as far as I was concerned, mission accomplished. I got my guest, we're on time, all is good in the world. Anyway, a couple of moments later, the interview begins. Guy is the person whose name we still assumed was Guy Goma at the time. Is asked, if he was surprised. The first question is along the lines of, we just got the verdict, which the BBC misreported at the time, by the way, and said that the Beatles record label had won, when in fact Apple Computer had won. But that's just a sidebar on a day of multiple cock-ups. And the first question to the guest is, something on the lines of, were you surprised by the verdict? Anyway, he's introduced, as Guy Goma. I don't remember necessarily seeing his reaction, which was something like, when he was introduced as Guy Goma, his face goes something like that. And I don't remember necessarily seeing that. But what I do remember distinctly is he was asked if he was surprised by the verdict, and the answer came back along the lines of, yes, I'm surprised that I'm coming here and this interview is coming over me, so yes, I'm very surprised. Now, there's a cacophony going on in the news gallery, so I literally say out loud, did he just say what I think he said? But no one's listening to me because they're all shouting, there's noise here and that. Now, I didn't know at the time that they were frantically trying to get the line up to the reporter outside the High Court, Rob Pittam. Anyway, long story short, he's asked 2 or 3 questions, interview is over. I go meet him afterwards and I say, were you not expecting an interview? He said, no. I said, I'm very, very sorry. Show him out the building, come back to my desk, look aghast at the presenter who's come back to sit next to me. I'm just like, what the bleeding hell was that? And I sent off an email to my entire department, the Business and Economics Unit, along the lines of, this guy could barely speak English, let alone form a cogent argument on the Apple v Apple court case. It's not good enough. Because I still just thought this was just a bad guest. Anyway, the penny drops a couple of minutes later when another producer from the main news programme comes to our desk, our little business bunker, and says to me, have you got a Guy Goma as a guest? And I said, yes. He's like, oh, he's in stage door reception. Apparently he's been waiting there quite a while. Ah, I said, that explains 1 or 2 things. So I kind of, in a blur of sweat and panic, I launched myself from my chair, sped through the corridor down to the stage door reception, where I found Guy Goma, who I should point out looked exactly like his picture. Anyway, understandably, he wasn't especially happy, having just seen himself or someone with his name strap underneath his name talking reasonably incomprehensibly about something which he clearly knew nothing about. So I apologised profusely, genuinely and profusely. I said, look, we'll try and make everything right. It was obviously mistaken identity. We'll pre-record an interview with you. We'll run it later, and we'll make everything right. And so when I went off shift a few hours later, I left a note for the person replacing me along the lines of, whatever you do, you must run this interview with Guy Goma. And so, of course, that's not what they did, and it didn't run, which understandably, again, angered him further. He wrote a kind of furious screed on, polemic almost on his blog, and clearly wasn't very happy. And although I don't have definitive proof and it's too late to kind of find this now, I was led to believe that he made a formal complaint. I don't know if that's necessarily true or not. And that complaint, along with the embarrassment, let's call it, or that the BBC or certain people at the BBC felt that this interview had brought on them, let's just say it didn't do me any favours.
So I was going to ask, what was the reaction, or how did it affect you both personally and professionally, and also Guy Goma as well, who had completely inadvertently got caught up in this situation?
I mean, the rest of that week was pretty. So when we realised that it was mistaken identity, I sent another email to my department along the lines of, ignore my previous email, and figured that was that. And everything was, calm like the sea off Amity Island before Jaws poked his noggin above the surface until the Friday. And on the Friday, I walked into the main newsroom and I saw the interview with the man we now know and love as Guy Goma playing across the media manager's screen. Now, the media managers are the gatekeepers to all things broadcastable. So, and I had worked on many night shifts with this woman, and I said to her, I went up to her and I said, well, what's this? Like someone at Millbank asked for it. That's the parliamentary unit. Someone at Millbank. So what do you mean someone at Millbank? It's like, well, someone at Millbank. It's like, what, an editor, a producer, one of us? She's like, no, one of us. I was like, oh. And that was when I walked back to myself and I thought, bugger, if people at Millbank have heard about this, it's only a matter of time before everyone at the BBC has heard about this. And if everyone at the BBC has watched this video, it's only a matter of time before everyone outside the BBC has watched it. I'm screwed. And And sure enough, that afternoon, I get a call from the BBC press office. It's going to be in the Mail and the Guardian on Saturday, which, as anyone working in the media, or certainly the news industry, will know, is the worst time for a story that you don't want to run, because if it goes in the Saturday papers, it's then followed by all the Sunday papers and then followed by all the Monday papers. So 3 days of newspaper coverage there. But it got far worse because The Sun had, and Jerome Starkey, who's now their defence editor, and at the time was, I think, in his words, the lowest rung on the kind of, in the pecking order, he was dispatched to kind of, try and track Guy down, and they still do this. They have a tip line at the newspaper, and they put the number in the paper. Someone called it, clearly, told them where Guy was, and so Jerome went out there with the photographer and doorstepped him. And at the same time, the morning editor of News 24 had also been told by Kevin Backhurst, then the controller of News 24, now the Director General of RTE in Ireland. Kevin had told Simon Waldman to find out who this guy was. Okay, because no one knew who he was. All the papers were like, the BBC put the wrong person on air. No one knew that even though he was the wrong guy with a small g, that he was the wrong guy with a capital G, okay? And so that was until so don't forget, we've had the interview on May the 8th, then it's running all the weekend papers after that. May the 16th, that's a Tuesday, okay, so the Tuesday after of the following week, that is when Guy's true identity, in fact, the Monday evening, the night before, on the 15th, a week later, Simon Waldman pens an editor's blog. He's managed to track down who he is because he finds his kind of little perforated badge, like the carbon copy that Guy Goma had signed, which Simon told me, he found it. I was like, what, his signature? Is like, yeah, what did you see? It's like, it was a squiggle. It's like, a squiggle! It's like, maybe a squiggle was responsible for this whole, debacle. Anyway, so Simon had managed to track him down and had written a blog about, he was actually there for a job interview. He was, of course, misreported initially as being a cab driver, which he's not. And I know people still say to me today, oh, that was the cab. No, he was not a taxi driver. So he'd been misreported as a cab driver. The BBC was being mocked, left, right and centre. Everyone was playing this video, not just in the UK, on websites and on other TV channels, but also around the world. And then it was revealed who he actually was. He was tracked down, and then things just exploded as far as Guy was concerned, because he became basically a celebrity. He was on like every single news channel. He was on Friday Night with Jonathan Ross. He was on the Big Fat Quiz of the Year. He was invited to the Princess Trust 30th birthday bash, and sat next to Shane Ward and kind of, hung out a little bit with Ant and Dec, who were kind of presenting it at the time. And so that's kind of his trajectory. And then my trajectory was that there was a bank, I can't remember, it was about 3 weeks later, and I had been taken off the kind of output editing shift, but then I was still, doing some reporting shift, and I'd been asked to come in to cover a reporting shift. Put my best suit on, kind of turned up nice and early, and then before I even sat down, my then boss took me aside, and he's like, I can't let you go on air. He's like, bosses wanted to put a letter on your file. I don't know what that means. And he couldn't let me go on air. And I was like, well, what is that for? He's like, no, I'll just have to see, he said, how the mood music was before seeing if he could let me go back on air. Now, my hunch and my belief is that because I then spoke to Kevin for my book, and he said, that's nonsense. He never, if someone makes a mistake, that's fine, as long as it doesn't happen again, otherwise you're going to basically crush everyone's creativity. And he never, bewildered at the suggestion. So my theory is that this was taking me off air was in anticipation of potential blowback to my bosses, that they didn't want to run the risk of being given a dressing down by the powers that be for putting me on air and then kind of, almost rubbing their faces in it. That's my theory. But the long and the short of it is that I was taken off air. I wasn't allowed to go back on air to do reporting, which is, of course, as we've discussed, what I always wanted to do. And I was left in no doubt that if I wanted to pursue my ambitions, at least in the short term, short being, 6 months to a year, then I would need to look elsewhere. And so that's what I did. And so I left the BBC in November of that year, just, do the maths, 5 months later.
So 20 years later, you've written a book about the experience. Why do you think interest in the story has endured for so long?
I mean, look, I knew that there would still be interest, and that's obviously why I wrote the book to coincide with the 20th anniversary, just to kind of get maximum publicity. I think that Guy has just, there's never been anything quite like it before or since. I mean, I know it sounds hyperbolic to say it's the greatest, TV's greatest cock up. And I mean, it's not just me. I mean, there are programs you'll see on TV all the time. Channel 5's had a show in November, I think it was, TV's most embarrassing moments of all time. And this was their number one. Okay, Sky did a poll 2 or 3 years ago, TV's most memorable moments. Okay, so not cock-ups or mistakes or blunders or whatever. And this was number 14, like up there with, Basil Fawlty kind of, Don't Mention the War episode, or Del Boy falling through the bar, or the death of Dirty Den. This is where Guy's tour de farce, where this accidental interview of the wrong guy is lodged in the nostalgia and the kind of conscience of certainly the British public, but I think worldwide, as being just one of the most iconic moments of television, because it was surprising, it was heartwarming, it was joyful. It has brought so much joy to so many people. And the reasons for that is, of course, yes, it was the BBC. You don't expect to see this kind of thing on the BBC. It was a mistake, and on the surface, it's funny, but on the next level, it's also, he did, for someone who didn't know anything about the subject and doesn't speak English and still doesn't speak English particularly brilliantly, he didn't do too badly. And many people would remark that, look, you get experts who are coming on TV and babble away, without saying much, politicians being a case in point. But I think a lot of people also, they recognise the good-naturedness of Guy, in the sense that he could have kind of stood up and said, no, you're wrong, I'm the wrong person, and run out kind of, screaming or something like that. But he didn't want to embarrass the presenter. His late mother always used to say to him, if you see a mistake, fix it first before you tell the other person that they've made a mistake, so as to avoid embarrassing that other person. And I think people see that decency and they warm to it. And then I think finally is the issue that people see this interview and they think, there but for the grace of God go I. Like, that could have happened to anyone. What happened to me could have happened to anyone. What could have happened to Guy could have happened to anyone. And what would they have done had they been in Guy's shoes? Don't forget, didn't know anything about the matter at hand, barely, didn't speak English, and was there for a job interview. He was already nervous about his job interview. That face that he put on, until you see that face, and you can see this in the ISO recording, the kind of raw footage that wasn't broadcast at the time, he is looking around studio, nervous, because he thinks he's about to have his job interview. He doesn't think it's a studio. Someone had come to offer him makeup and he said to them, I don't need makeup, I've just got a job interview. He literally only realised he was on TV when the presenter turned to him, introduced him as Guy Goma, and then all of a sudden all these monitors in the studio had his face on them. That is when the penny dropped for Guy. And it was up until that moment he thought he was there for the job interview. And then he still then, after this joyful interview that was the conclusion of this concatenation of cock-ups, Guy actually went out, and then he actually had to come back into the BBC for his actual job interview, which, and this is a question that he is still asked every single day, so don't you dare ask me, Danny, Guy did not get the job. Okay, and there was even a petition running, give Guy the job or a better job. There's thousands of people signed this petition for Guy at the time. So I think because of all of that, and then of course he had all of these appearances and all of these interviews, and I think everyone just empathizes with Guy, because you would have to have a heart of stone or be an AI powered cyborg to not smile. He wasn't trying to be someone else. He wasn't trying to pretend to know things that he didn't, or that he knew these things. He wasn't trying to suggest that he was a guest. He was just trying to survive and trying to avoid embarrassing the presenter and the BBC as well. And I think for all of those reasons, I know it's a very long answer, but for all of those reasons, people just have a lot of love for Guy. People still stop him on the street, or they shout "Legend" at him when he's crossing the road. And I mean, it kind of reached its apogee, the kind of coverage we had when Saturday Night Live UK, the opening monologue of their final show was doing the Guy face, and the actor saying that he, it was his dream job to kind of play Guy Goma. I mean, not big fan of the show itself, but that was just hilarious, and was just shows you just how, and I'm very happy that all of my efforts at kind of publicizing the book have led to kind of, people being reacquainted with Guy, those who remember him, and also a whole new generation of people that may not have seen the interview Go Out Live, may not have even been born back then, and who are still seeing this and still loving it and laughing. And Guy, 20 years later, is still bringing joy to hundreds of millions of people around the world. And that's just one of the most beautiful things of this entire story.
Very good. Well, I don't want your career to be defined solely in this moment. So let's talk a little bit more. You talked about leaving the BBC for the reasons that you talked about. And in 2007, you joined Bloomberg. Compare and contrast with the BBC in terms of its journalism and culture.
So first of all, I should say that Bloomberg Television today, and let's distinguish between Bloomberg the Newswire, which has always been number one, or at the very least considered and respected as much as Reuters, probably more so, and in terms of market share of everything else. And as a business, it's one of the great kind of technology businesses, information providers, news organizations there is. Television, I don't know how it is now because I've not been there for, where are we now, for 10 years. But television certainly back then was not a priority. Everything was in service to the terminal with the ultimate goal of getting more subscriptions for the terminal, which I think cost something like £30,000 a month, right? So television was kind of subservient to that. So Bloomberg was not a television first broadcaster. And when I came in, I like to think that I kind of helped in kind of professionalizing the TV side of things. I don't mean necessarily the presenting, because there were some decent presenters who have gone on to bigger and better things as well. But I certainly mean in terms of the reporting, in terms of bringing personality, in terms of speaking in terms that, an audience, that a much broader audience would understand, and certainly in terms of packaging. Like creating packages was something they just didn't do, couldn't do, didn't know how to do. And again, I'm talking about 2007, I'm not talking about today. So it was a very different organization. I mean, we weren't, it was obviously a commercial organization, but TV was not, like a profit driver. Again, I'm talking about back then. I don't know how the lie of the land is right now. So I think it was very different because the BBC very much kind of television, radio, broadcaster first, and a real loyalty, I would say, to kind of quality product in terms of television packages, live reports, radio. It certainly was the best, and is still considered to be one of the best, broadcast organizations in the world.
So finally, another fun question to wrap things up. If you were sent on assignment to the Amazon rainforest, which film, TV series, audiobook, and podcast would you make sure was on your phone that you took with you?
So film, I mean, I guess it would have to be The Terminator, but I might also try and sneak in House of the Flying Daggers with Jet Li because it's just beautiful. TV show, not He-Man, so maybe Better Call Saul. Again, I mean, I just marvel, even like little things like filming the inside, like a coffee being poured by a vending machine from inside the vending machine. I just love these little kind of details. Podcast, the ones I listen to most, aside from yours, obviously, would be probably The Rest is History, or I'm a big fan of Freakonomics, not all of it, but I like to listen to Freakonomics as well. Audiobook, well, I mean, obviously you can have the audio edition of The Wrong Guy, but listening to myself, because I narrate it myself, the audiobook, so it wouldn't be that one. I guess if I'm in the Amazon, and perhaps I would be on the Peruvian side of things, or in another country in the Amazon, I guess it would be appropriate to maybe have Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude. Actually, you know what? Let's bring things back, because I like to always end, in a similar way to beginning. Let's go with Aunt Julia and the Scriptwriter by Mario Vargas Llosa.
That's been fascinating. Elliott Gotkine, thanks very much for being a guest on Here Comes Pod. You might have got the wrong man for your show, but I think I got the right man for the job of telling a fascinating story. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Thanks for having me.